When Rosa Matthews enters her son Calvin's restaurant on her birthday, she expects celebration, but instead faces shocking disrespect from a young waiter. What starts as a painful moment becomes the spark for a community-wide movement against prejudice. How does Rosa's quiet strength turn a local injustice into something so much bigger? And how does Calvin transform their restaurant into a symbol of inclusion and hope? Like, comment, and subscribe to join this inspiring journey of resilience, justice, and the fight to ensure everyone has a seat at the table. What would you have done in Rosa's shoes? Let us know in the comments. Rosa Matthews' footsteps echoed softly as she made her way down the familiar city street, the golden afternoon light casting long shadows across the sidewalk. She clutched her handbag tightly, her fingers feeling the worn leather that had accompanied her for years like an old friend. Today was her 68th birthday, and she had plans. Plans that involved the one place that had become a second home to her over the years. The neighborhood table, the restaurant her son had poured his heart into building. Rosa's heart swelled with pride as she thought about her son, Calvin Matthews. She smiled softly, reminiscing about how far they had come. Calvin had faced countless obstacles growing up, many of which were not of his own making. Being a young black man in a world that wasn't always kind had meant battling discrimination and prejudice at every turn. But Calvin had never let it break him. He had risen above it, fighting for his place in the world, and for his dream of owning a restaurant that would not only serve food, but serve the community. The neighborhood table was more than just a restaurant. It was a symbol of everything they had overcome together. Rosa had been there every step of the way, from the initial idea that Calvin had sketched out on the back of an old receipt to the grand opening where the neighborhood had come together to celebrate. It wasn't just a place for meals, it was a place for people. It was where people from all walks of life, black, white, young, old, could come and feel welcome. Calvin had wanted it to be a haven, and for years it had been just that. Today, Rosa was headed there to celebrate her birthday, expecting a quiet meal and perhaps a surprise from Calvin and his staff. She had visited many times over the years, sometimes with family, sometimes with friends, and occasionally on her own. But each time, she felt a deep connection to the place, a connection that was rooted not only in her love for her son, but in the love she had for her community. The late afternoon sun bathed the street in a warm glow as she approached the restaurant. The outdoor seating area was bustling with patrons, laughing and enjoying the pleasant autumn breeze. She could already smell the inviting aroma of roasted chicken, garlic, and herbs wafting through the air, making her stomach rumble in anticipation. Rosa had always loved the smell of Calvin's cooking. It reminded her of home, of the countless meals they had shared in their small apartment when it was just the two of them against the world. She paused for a moment before entering, gazing at the familiar sign that hung above the door. The golden letters read, "The Neighborhood Table," and underneath, Calvin had painted a simple phrase, "A place for everyone." Rosa smiled, feeling a swell of pride in her chest. That's what Calvin had always wanted, and he had succeeded. His restaurant had become a beloved institution in the neighborhood. With a deep breath, Rosa pushed open the door and stepped inside. The moment Rosa walked through the door, she felt something was off. The usual warm, welcoming atmosphere of the neighborhood table seemed dimmer, more subdued. The familiar clatter of dishes and the murmur of conversation were there. But there was an undercurrent of tension that Rosa couldn't quite place. She glanced around the room, noting a few new faces among the staff. The regulars greeted her with warm smiles and friendly nods. But there were also unfamiliar eyes that lingered on her for a little too long. Rosa felt the slightest prick of discomfort, but she brushed it off. It was, after all, a busy evening. Her eyes landed on a young waiter standing at the counter, a newcomer who seemed preoccupied with a notepad. He was tall, with neatly combed blonde hair and sharp features, but his expression was anything but welcoming. His name tag read Evan Carter. He was new, that much was clear. Rosa had never seen him before. She approached the counter, her heart lit with anticipation, expecting the same warm greeting she had always received when she visited. Smiling, she cleared her throat. "Hello there. I believe I have a reservation for tonight. It's under Matthews." Evan didn't look up. His brows were furrowed, as if the very act of looking at the reservation list was a burden. Without so much as a glance in Rosa's direction, he muttered, "No tables available tonight. We're fully booked." Rosa blinked, the smile on her face faltering. "Oh, I see," she said, her voice still kind, though laced with confusion. "But I made a reservation. My son Calvin owns the place. We spoke yesterday and he said everything was set." Evan's eyes flickered up then, his expression unchanging, but his gaze cold. There was something in his look, something Rosa had seen before, too many times to count. It was a look that told her she wasn't being seen as just another customer. She wasn't being seen at all. "I'm telling you," Evan said curtly, "there's nothing available. We're packed tonight." The dismissive tone hit Rosa like a sudden chill, and her heart tightened with unease. She was no stranger to this kind of treatment, though it had been a long time since she had felt it so blatantly in a place that was supposed to be a refuge. She had grown up in the South during a time when people who looked like her weren't welcome in certain spaces, and while the world had changed in many ways, moments like this reminded her that some things hadn't changed enough. Rosa straightened her posture slightly, determined to keep her composure. She had dealt with worse in her life, far worse. But this was her son's restaurant, the one place where she should never have to feel like she didn't belong. "There must be a mistake," Rosa said, her voice a bit firmer now. "Could you double-check the reservation list? My son, Calvin Matthews, confirmed it himself." Evan let out a sigh of impatience, finally lowering his notepad to give her a full look. His eyes traveled over her, taking in her simple dress, her worn purse, and the lines of age on her face. His expression twisted slightly, as if he had made some kind of internal judgment. "Listen," he said, his tone filled with annoyance. "I don't care who your son is. There's no table for you here tonight. Maybe try somewhere else." Rosa's heart sank. The coldness in his words was like a slap in the face. She had come here expecting warmth, expecting to celebrate with the people who had come to feel like family, and instead, she was being turned away as if she didn't belong. She stood there for a moment, stunned into silence. The memories of past indignities came rushing back. Times when she had been told in no uncertain terms that she wasn't welcome, that she didn't belong. It was a feeling she thought she had left behind years ago, but here it was again, rearing its ugly head in the one place she had never expected to find. Rosa drew a breath, steadying herself. "I've been coming here since the day this place opened," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I know everyone who works here. My son worked hard to make this a place for everyone. I don't think he would be very happy to hear that you're turning his own mother away." Evan crossed his arms over his chest, his smirk widening into something more mocking. "Like I said," he sneered, "there's no place for you here. You can either leave now or wait around, though I doubt you'll get anywhere." The sting of his words hit Rosa harder than she expected. She felt the heat rising in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a deep, simmering anger. This wasn't just a mix-up or a mistake. This was something far more familiar, a quiet, insidious type of discrimination that Rosa had spent her entire life fighting against. Her instinct was to walk out, to leave and never return. But then she thought of Calvin. She thought of everything he had worked for, everything they had built together, and she knew she couldn't just walk away. Not this time. "I think I'll wait," Rosa said calmly, though her voice carried a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. "And while I do, I'd like to speak with the manager." Evan's smirk faltered, but only slightly. He gave a careless shrug. "Suit yourself," he muttered, disappearing into the back to fetch the manager. Rosa stood at the counter, her heart still racing. She could feel the eyes of the other patrons on her now, their whispers barely audible above the clinking of silverware. Some of them looked curious, others uncomfortable. She hated being the center of attention like this, but she knew she couldn't back down. Not when it was her dignity on the line and her son's reputation. As she waited, the memories continued to swirl in her mind. Memories of long-ago slights, of being treated like she didn't matter. She had always prided herself on her ability to rise above it, to carry herself with dignity no matter how she was treated. But this felt different. This was Calvin's place. This was supposed to be their place. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity as Rosa waited by the counter. The murmurs in the restaurant grew quieter as the patrons resumed their meals. though a few glances continued to dart in her direction. She was no stranger to those kinds of looks. She had felt them all her life. But standing here now in the restaurant her own son owned, those looks felt sharper, more painful. Finally, the door to the kitchen swung open, and Clint Davis, the restaurant's middle-aged manager, appeared. His brow was furrowed, clearly unsure of what he was walking into. But the moment his eyes landed on Rosa, recognition dawned on his face. His stiff posture immediately relaxed, and his lips parted in surprise. "Mrs. Matthews," Clint said, hurrying over with an apologetic smile. "I'm so sorry about this. There must have been some sort of misunderstanding." Rosa could see the genuine concern in Clint's expression. She had known him since the restaurant opened, and he had always treated her with respect. But even as he approached her with a smile, Rosa's anger simmered beneath the surface. The issue wasn't just about her table. It was about the way she had been treated, the casual dismissal she had faced at the hands of Evan. "I'm sure there was," Rosa replied, her voice even but firm. "But this isn't just about a mistake with the reservation. That young man," she nodded in the direction of the kitchen where Evan had disappeared, "spoke to me in a way that no customer should ever be spoken to. He made it clear that I wasn't welcome here." Clint's expression faltered, and his gaze flicked briefly toward the kitchen before returning to Rosa. "I'm really sorry, Mrs. Matthews," he said again, his voice more subdued now. "That's not the way we do things here. I'll speak with him, I promise." Rosa shook her head slightly, frustration growing. "I'm not asking for special treatment, Clint. I just want to know why someone would think they can treat anyone, let alone the owner's mother, like they don't belong here." Clint's face flushed with embarrassment, and he seemed at a loss for words. "You're right, of course. Let me make this right. I'll get you seated at once." Rosa didn't move from her spot. She knew Clint meant well, but she also knew that simply getting her a table wasn't enough. The problem wasn't just that Evan had denied her a seat. It was the deeper issue of why he had felt comfortable treating her the way he had. "This isn't just about a table," Rosa said, her voice soft but firm. "It's about something bigger than that." Clint's discomfort was palpable. He nodded, his face tight with understanding. "You're absolutely right, Mrs. Matthews. I'll handle it." Rosa knew he meant well, but she also knew that handling it quietly in the back room wasn't enough. She had fought too hard, too long, to let moments like these pass without making them count. "I appreciate that, Clint," Rosa said, meeting his gaze, "but I want to make sure that no one else is ever treated this way in this restaurant." Clint nodded again, more firmly this time. "I promise, Mrs. Matthews, this won't happen again." As Clint walked back toward the kitchen to confront Evan, Rosa took a moment to gather herself. She felt drained, exhausted from the emotional toll of the encounter, but she knew she had done the right thing by speaking up. The world wasn't going to change unless people like her stood their ground, no matter how tired they were. She glanced around the room, noticing the way the other patrons had returned to their meals. The moment had passed for them, just another small disruption in their evening. But for Rosa, it was more than that. It was a reminder of the long road she had traveled to get here. For a moment, she felt that familiar weariness wash over her. She was tired of always having to fight, tired of always having to defend her right to be treated with respect. But then she thought of Calvin. She thought of the dreams he had for this place, the ideals he had built it on, and she knew she couldn't give up. Not now. As she waited for Clint to return, Rosa stood tall, her resolve hardening. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, like they weren't worthy of respect. And she wasn't going to let that happen. Not here, not in the place that she and Calvin had built together. Rosa stood in silence, watching Clint disappear into the kitchen. The hum of the restaurant buzzed around her, but she felt disconnected from it, as though the world had grown muffled. She let her gaze drift over the room. People were eating, laughing, talking, unaware of the storm brewing inside her. For them, it was just another evening at a popular restaurant. But for Rosa, it was a night tainted with the bitter taste of humiliation and something else, familiar anger. She closed her eyes for a moment, willing herself to stay calm. She didn't want to cause a scene, but neither did she want to let this slide. The truth was, she had experienced this kind of quiet discrimination her entire life. But the sting had never faded. The world had changed in many ways. And yet here she was, still having to remind people that she deserved to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. Her mind wandered to the past, to memories she had tried to bury, but never fully could. Rosa had grown up in the South during the Civil Rights Movement. She remembered walking down streets with her head held high, even when her heart ached with the knowledge that she wasn't welcome in many of the places she passed. There had been separate schools, separate bathrooms, even separate waiting areas at the doctor's office. She had learned from a young age that the world saw her differently, that it didn't always see her at all, and yet she had never let it break her. She had raised Calvin to believe in his worth, to never let the world tell him he was less than anyone else. She had fought to give him a future where his skin color wouldn't be a barrier, where he could walk into any room and know he belonged. But seeing Evan's dismissive smirk, hearing his cold words brought all of those old wounds rushing back to the surface. It wasn't just about her, it was about the generations who had fought for basic human dignity. It was about the future she wanted for her son, her grandchildren, and everyone else who came after them. Her hand clenched around the strap of her purse as she opened her eyes, her resolve hardening. She couldn't let this moment pass in silence. Evan needed to understand the weight of his words. People needed to understand that this kind of behavior couldn't be tolerated, not in a place like the neighborhood table, not anywhere. Clint reappeared from the kitchen, a grim expression on his face. Behind him, Evan trailed reluctantly, his posture stiff with defiance. Rosa could tell from the way he stood that he wasn't sorry. Not really. He hadn't learned anything. He didn't believe he had done anything wrong. "Mrs. Matthews," Clint began, his voice overly polite, "I spoke with Evan, and he'd like to apologize for the misunderstanding." Rosa's eyes flicked to Evan, who stood there, arms crossed over his chest, his mouth twisted in what could barely pass for a remorseful expression. "I'm sorry," Evan said, the words mechanical, devoid of any real emotion. "I didn't know you were the owner's mother." There it was, the reason behind the apology. Not because Evan had realized he had acted disrespectfully, not because he understood the hurt he had caused, but because he had insulted the wrong person. Someone connected. Rosa's lips tightened. "It shouldn't matter who I am," she said, her voice calm but laced with steel. "It shouldn't matter if I'm Calvin's mother or a stranger off the street. The way you treated me, the way you spoke to me, is unacceptable, and it's not just a misunderstanding." Evan's eyes flickered, his face hardening with annoyance. He hadn't expected to be challenged further. In his mind, the matter should have been settled by now. Clint shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Rosa and Evan. "Mrs. Matthews, we deeply regret what happened," he said carefully. "I'll make sure this doesn't happen again." Rosa held Clint's gaze for a moment, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. He meant well, she knew that, but he wasn't the one who needed to learn this lesson. Evan was. "And what happens now?" Rosa asked, her voice cutting through the tension in the air. "What will you do to ensure that this place, the place my son built to be inclusive and welcoming, doesn't become a place where people are treated with disrespect?" Clint opened his mouth to respond, but it was Evan who spoke first. "Look," Evan said, his voice rising in frustration, "I already apologized. What more do you want?" Rosa's heart beat faster, but she kept her face impassive. She had faced worse than a disrespectful waiter in her life. But it wasn't about this one moment. It was about the patterns she had seen over and over again. The assumption that people like her didn't belong, that they could be pushed aside and treated as less. It wasn't just about what she wanted, it was about what was right. "I don't want anything from you, Evan," Rosa said, her voice soft but firm. "But you need to understand that when you talk to someone, the way you talk to me, you're not just being rude. You're telling them they don't belong. You're telling them they're not worthy of being here." Evan rolled his eyes and Clint shot him a warning look. "Mrs. Matthews," Clint said, stepping in, "I'll make sure that this is addressed. I'll personally handle it." But Rosa wasn't finished. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the knowledge that this was bigger than a single confrontation. The other patrons had started to watch again, their conversations quieting as they tuned into the unfolding scene. "This isn't just about me," Rosa said, raising her voice slightly so that the entire restaurant could hear. "This is about what's happening every day to people who look like me, to people who are treated like they don't belong in places like this. And it has to stop." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Rosa hadn't planned to speak out like this, but now that the moment had come, she couldn't hold it back. She had been quiet for too long, letting the small slights and everyday indignities slide by. But not today. Not here. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for everyone who had ever been made to feel invisible, everyone who had been denied their place at the table. Evan looked increasingly uncomfortable, his face reddening as he realized how many eyes were on him. Clint, too, seemed unsure of what to do next, glancing around as if searching for a way to de-escalate the situation. "Mrs. Matthews," Clint said again, more quietly this time, "we're really sorry. Let's get you seated and—" "I don't need a table," Rosa interrupted, her voice sharp but controlled. "What I need is to know that this place will live up to the values my son built it on. I need to know that this won't happen to anyone else who walks through these doors." Clint swallowed hard, nodding. "I promise, Mrs. Matthews. We'll take steps to make sure this never happens again." Rosa gave a small nod in return. "I'll hold you to that," she said softly, her gaze lingering on Evan for a moment longer before she turned away. She could feel the weight of the patron's stares as she made her way to the door, her heart still pounding, her hands trembling slightly. But she knew she had done the right thing. As she stepped outside, the cool evening air hit her face, and she breathed it in deeply, trying to steady her emotions. The quiet of the street was a stark contrast to the storm that had just unfolded inside. Rosa stood there for a moment, gazing out at the city she had called home for so long. The city had changed in so many ways over the years, but some things hadn't changed enough. She thought of Calvin again, of the dreams he had for his restaurant, and she knew that the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Unbeknownst to Rosa, the events inside the restaurant were already beginning to ripple out into the world beyond its walls. As she had stood her ground, a few of the patrons had discreetly recorded the interaction on their phones, capturing the confrontation between her and Evan. By the time Rosa stepped out onto the street, those videos were already making their way across social media platforms, shared and reshared with increasing speed. One of the patrons who had filmed the exchange was a young woman named Emily Jenkins, a local college student who had come to the restaurant for dinner with friends. As she watched the situation unfold, Emily had felt a surge of anger and empathy for the older woman who had been treated so unfairly. Without thinking, she had pulled out her phone and started recording. Now, as she sat with her friends, scrolling through her phone, she realized just how powerful the footage was. Rosa's voice, calm yet filled with emotion, resonated deeply. She had spoken not just for herself, but for countless others who had experienced similar treatment. The weight of her words, her dignity in the face of disrespect, moved Emily in a way she hadn't expected. "I'm posting this," Emily said, her fingers hovering over her phone's screen. "People need to see this." Her friends nodded in agreement. "Yeah," one of them said. "This is important. People need to know what's happening." With a few taps, Emily uploaded the video to her social media accounts, adding a caption that read, "This woman stood up to injustice at the neighborhood table tonight. We need more people like her in this world. So respect for Rosa, or no room for racism." Within minutes, the post began to gain traction. Comments flooded in, praising Rosa for her courage and condemning the waiter's behavior. People from all over the city and beyond began sharing the video, adding their own messages of support. Some called for boycotts of the restaurant, while others urged the owners to take swift action. In the span of an hour, "Respect for Rosa" and "No Room for Racism" were trending locally, and the video had been viewed thousands of times. People began tagging local activists, influencers, and even news outlets, drawing attention to the incident in a way that Rosa had never anticipated. At a nearby coffee shop, Melissa Perez, a well-known activist and organizer, saw the video appear in her feed. Melissa had dedicated her life to fighting racial injustice and advocating for marginalized communities, and the video struck a chord with her immediately. She watched Rosa calmly but firmly address the waiter, calling out the deeper issues that underpinned the interaction. Melissa didn't hesitate. She shared the video with her followers, adding her own comment, This is why we fight. This is why we stand up. Respect for Rosa. As more and more people shared the video, the momentum grew. Soon, local news stations picked up the story, with reporters calling for statements from the restaurant. Activists began organizing online, calling for a protest in front of the neighborhood table to demand accountability and action. While the story spread like wildfire online, Calvin Matthews was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around him. He had spent the afternoon meeting with suppliers for the restaurant, finalizing deals for fresh ingredients and planning for the upcoming season. It wasn't until he checked his phone at the end of the day that he realized something was very wrong. His notifications were out of control. Dozens, no, hundreds of texts, missed calls, and social media alerts filled his screen. His heart sank as he began to read through them. "Calvin, there's something going on at the restaurant. You need to get here as soon as possible. Dude, did you see the video? You better deal with this fast. Man, the restaurant is blowing up online. What happened?" Confusion turned to dread as Calvin opened one of the messages and saw the video. His stomach twisted into a tight knot as he watched the scene unfold. His mother, Rosa, standing firm as a young waiter, someone he didn't even recognize, dismissed her with cruel indifference. The anger in his chest grew with every second of the video. How could this happen? How could someone in his own restaurant be a place that he had built to be a safe, welcoming space for everyone, treat his mother, of all people, with such disrespect? Without thinking, Calvin bolted out of his office, grabbing his jacket and keys. He needed to get to the restaurant, and he needed to get there now. By the time Calvin arrived, the situation had already escalated beyond anything he could have imagined. A small crowd had gathered outside the restaurant. Activists, journalists, and onlookers, all drawn by the rapidly spreading story. News vans were parked along the curb, their bright lights casting an eerie glow over the scene. Calvin pushed through the crowd, his mind racing. He had spent years building the neighborhood table as a place where people of all backgrounds could come together. How had it come to this? How had it become a symbol of the very kind of prejudice he had fought so hard against? When Calvin stepped inside the restaurant, he immediately spotted Clint, who looked pale and flustered, standing by the front counter. Evan was nowhere to be seen. The staff moved around the room nervously, unsure of what to do with the growing tension in the air. "Clint," Calvin said, his voice low and tight with anger. "What happened here?" Clint looked up, his eyes filled with guilt. "Calvin, I'm so sorry. Your mother, there was a misunderstanding with one of the new waiters. Evan, he didn't realize who she was and..." Calvin's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding together. "It doesn't matter who she is," he snapped. "She's a customer. She's a human being. How could you let this happen?" Clint swallowed hard, looking down at the floor. "I'm sorry," he repeated. "I talked to Evan, but he didn't take it well. He just doesn't seem to get it." Calvin's eyes darkened as the anger in his chest boiled over. "Where is he now?" "He's in the back," Clint said, glancing toward the kitchen. I was about to send him home." Calvin nodded sharply, his mind made up. "He's not going home. He's fired." Without another word, Calvin marched toward the kitchen, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. He couldn't believe this had happened, in his own restaurant, to his own mother. As soon as Calvin entered the kitchen, he spotted Evan leaning against a counter, his face still twisted with a mixture of defiance and irritation. "You," Calvin said, his voice icy. Evan looked up, his smirk fading slightly as he registered the look on Calvin's face. "What's the problem now?" Evan muttered, though his voice lacked the same arrogance it had carried earlier. "The problem is that you don't belong here," Calvin said coldly. "You're fired. Get your things and leave." Evan's eyes widened in shock, his mouth opening to protest. "Wait, what? You're firing me? Over some misunderstanding?" "This wasn't a misunderstanding," Calvin snapped. "You disrespected my mother. You disrespected one of our most loyal customers. And from what I hear, you've been treating people like they're less than you from the moment you started working here." Evan sputtered, his face turned red. "That's not fair. I didn't know." "You didn't have to know," Calvin said, his voice cutting through Evan's excuses. "You should treat every single person who walks through these doors with respect, regardless of who they are. That's what this place stands for. And if you can't understand that, you don't belong here. Evan's face twisted with fury, but he didn't argue any further. With a final huff, he stormed out of the kitchen, muttering under his breath. Calvin watched him go, his heart still pounding with anger. But as the door swung shut behind Evan, Calvin felt a weight settle in his chest. The damage had already been done, and now he had to face the consequences. By the time Calvin returned to the front of the restaurant, the crowd outside had grown even larger. Reporters had gathered by the windows, their cameras trained on the door, waiting for a statement. The noise of the crowd outside clashed with the tense, hushed atmosphere inside the restaurant. Staff members glanced nervously at each other, unsure of what to do next. Calvin knew that there was no avoiding the situation. The video of his mother's confrontation with Evan had already spread across the internet, and now the entire city and beyond was watching. People were calling for justice, for accountability. Others were calling for boycotts, claiming that the restaurant had allowed discrimination to fester within its walls. Calvin took a deep breath, running a hand over his face. This was a nightmare, but he couldn't run from it. He had to face it head on. He owed that much to his mother, to his community, and to everyone who had ever believed in the mission of the neighborhood table. Clint approached him cautiously. "Calvin, what do we do?" Calvin's jaw tightened as he considered the options. There was only one thing he could do. He needed to speak directly to people, to take responsibility and set things right. "I'm going outside, Wayne," Calvin said, his voice steady. "I need to address the crowd." Clint looked uncertain. "Are you sure? It's pretty heated out there." "I'm sure," Calvin said firmly. "We need to own this. I need to own this." With that, Calvin straightened his shoulders and walked toward the door. The moment he stepped outside, the cameras flashed and the crowd surged forward, reporters shouting questions at him. But Calvin raised his hand, silencing them. "Please," Calvin began, his voice loud and clear. "I need to speak." The crowd quieted, though the tension in the air was palpable. Calvin could feel the weight of their eyes on him, the judgment in their stares. He took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before speaking. "My name is Calvin Matthew," he began, "and I'm the owner of the neighborhood table. Tonight, something happened inside this restaurant that goes against everything we stand for. My mother, Rosa Matthews, was disrespected and treated unfairly by one of our staff members. I want to make it clear that this kind of behavior is unacceptable, both in this restaurant and in any space where people come together." Calvin paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "I've fired the employee responsible, and I want to assure everyone here, and everyone watching, that we will be taking steps to ensure that something like this never happens again. This restaurant was built on the idea that everyone deserves a seat at the table, no matter who they are, where they come from, or what they look like. And I take full responsibility for making sure we live up to that mission." A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Calvin could feel the tension easing slightly. But he wasn't finished. "I know that an apology isn't enough," Calvin continued, his voice strong. "Actions speak louder than words. That's why, starting immediately, we will be implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all of our staff. We will work with community leaders and activists to create a safe, welcoming environment for everyone who walks through our doors. This restaurant is for the people, and I promise that we will do better." The crowd listened intently, their expressions a mix of relief and hope. Calvin could see that his words were resonating with them, but he also knew that actions would be the real test. "This isn't just about one incident," Calvin said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's about changing the culture, here and everywhere. We need to do better as a community, and I'm committed to being part of that change." As Calvin finished speaking, the crowd erupted into applause. It wasn't the wild, raucous applause of celebration. It was the steady, determined applause of a community that was ready to move forward together. Calvin stepped back, his heart still pounding, but a sense of relief beginning to settle over him. He had done what he needed to do. Now it was time to back up his words with action. As the applause faded and the crowd began to disperse, Calvin stood at the entrance of the neighborhood table, feeling both drained and uplifted. The night had been long, and though he had taken the first steps toward making things right, the weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on his shoulders. This was only the beginning. The crowd outside was thinning, but Calvin could still see a few journalists lingering, their cameras now lowered. They exchanged hushed words, perhaps waiting for more updates, maybe planning their next headlines. He caught glimpses of patrons, some who had been inside the restaurant when the incident occurred, leaving with expressions that ranged from quiet contemplation to clear approval of the stand he had taken. Calvin's phone buzzed again in his pocket, but this time he ignored it. The whirlwind of calls and notifications would have to wait. For now, he had only one person on his mind: his mother. Where had she gone? Pushing through the remaining reporters and well-wishers, Calvin re-entered the restaurant, the door closing behind him with a quiet thud. Inside, the atmosphere was more subdued, the staff cleaning up the remnants of a disrupted dinner service. The murmur of conversations was softer now, the tension that had filled the room earlier still lingering like the faint scent of garlic and rosemary in the air. "Has anyone seen my mom?" Calvin asked, his voice low but urgent, as he approached the hostess stand where Maya, one of his longest-serving employees, was helping a customer settle their bill. Maya glanced up, her face filled with concern. "She stepped outside about 20 minutes ago. She seemed upset but calm," she said gently, offering Calvin a sympathetic smile. Calvin thanked her and hurried back toward the side exit, stepping into the cool evening air. It took only a moment to spot Rosa. She was sitting on a bench just a few feet from the restaurant's entrance, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was a certain grace in the way she held herself, even now, dignified and strong, but undeniably weary. For a moment, Calvin simply stood there watching her. His heart swelled with a mix of emotions: gratitude, guilt, pride, and an overwhelming sense of love. This woman, his mother, had been his rock for as long as he could remember. She had faced so many battles in her life, had carried the weight of their world on her shoulders, and had never once faltered. Now it seemed like she was carrying the weight of his world too. Calvin slowly made his way over to her and sat down beside her on the bench. For a few moments they sat in silence, listening to the distant hum of the city. Rosa's hands remained folded in her lap, but Calvin could see the slight tremor in her fingers, a sign of the emotional toll the night had taken. "I'm sorry, Mama," Calvin finally said, his voice quiet, thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry this happened. I had no idea." "Stop that, baby," Rosa interrupted softly, turning her head slightly to look at him. Her eyes were calm but filled with a sadness Calvin hadn't seen in a long time. "This isn't your fault. It's the world we live in." "But it is," Calvin insisted, his voice shaking. "It happened in my restaurant, Mama. The one place where I promised it wouldn't happen. The one place I thought I had control over." Rosa sighed, her gaze returning to the street in front of her. The headlights of passing cars glinted off the sidewalk, casting fleeting shadows that danced across their feet. "We can't control everything, Calvin," she said, her voice low and steady. "The world is bigger than us. And even in places like the neighborhood table, we're still fighting the same battles. The important thing is that you're doing something about it. You're not letting it slide." Calvin looked down at his hands, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench. He had spent years building the neighborhood table into a place of inclusion, a place where people from all backgrounds could come together and share in something good. It was supposed to be a beacon of hope, a symbol of progress. Yet tonight had shown him that the fight for justice wasn't something that could ever truly be won. Not completely. It was a constant, ongoing battle. "Do you think I did the right thing?" Calvin asked quietly. "Firing Evan, addressing the crowd. I mean, I know I had to, but—" "You did the right thing," Rosa said firmly, turning to face him again. "You didn't let that boy get away with what he did. You stood up for what's right, and you made it clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated here. That's more than most people do." Calvin nodded, though he still felt the weight of doubt gnawing at him. He had taken action, but was it enough? Would it be enough to fix what had been broken, not just tonight, but in the hearts of the people who had witnessed the incident? Rosa seemed to sense his internal struggle, and she placed her hand gently on his. "This isn't just about one bad apple, Calvin," she said quietly. "It's about something much bigger. And I know you've been fighting it your whole life, just like I have. But you can't fix everything in one night. What matters is that you're trying." That's all you can do." Calvin swallowed the lump in his throat, the words hitting him hard. His mother had always been a pillar of strength, but she had also lived through more injustice than he could ever imagine. If she could find peace in the face of all that, then maybe he could too. "Thanks, Mama," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly. I just don't want to let you down." Rosa smiled softly, her eyes glistening in the dim streetlight. "You've never let me down, Calvin. Not once." The following morning, Calvin woke up to find that the story had taken on a life of its own. What had started as a single video shared by a few patrons had exploded into a citywide and even national conversation. News outlets were covering the incident, and the hashtags #, Respect for Rosa, and #No Room for Racism were trending on social media. People from all walks of life were chiming in, offering their support for Rosa and their outrage at the way she had been treated. But not all the responses were positive. Calvin scrolled through the comments on the restaurant's social media pages, feeling his heart sink. For every message of support, there was a counter-argument, an accusation that he had acted too quickly, that he had overreacted by firing Evan on the spot. Some comments accused him of caving to pressure or ruining a young man's career over a misunderstanding. This cancel culture nonsense is out of control. People can't even make mistakes anymore without getting fired. Way to destroy a guy's life for nothing. Pathetic. What happened to giving people a second chance? Calvin felt the familiar knot of frustration and anger forming in his chest as he read through the vitriol. He had expected backlash. He wasn't naive. But seeing the comments in black and white, knowing that people were siding with Evan without knowing the full story, made his blood boil. A particularly harsh comment caught his eye. Maybe if people like her didn't make everything about race, we wouldn't have these problems. Just saying. Calvin slammed his phone down on the kitchen counter, his jaw tight. He was furious. Furious that people could be so blind to the realities of what had happened. Furious that they could so easily dismiss the pain his mother had endured and the pain so many others like her had endured for generations. The anger that had simmered within him last night after firing Evan was now boiling over. He wanted to scream, to shout at the people who didn't understand, who didn't care to understand. But he knew that shouting into the void wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't change the minds of those who had already decided what they wanted to believe. He needed to be strategic. After taking a few deep breaths, Calvin grabbed his phone again and opened his email. There were countless unread messages, media inquiries, local activists offering their support, restaurant patrons sharing their experiences, but one in particular caught his eye. It was from Melissa Perez, the activist whose tweet had helped amplify the video in the first place. "Calvin, I know things are overwhelming right now, but I wanted to reach out and offer my support. You did the right thing, and your mother is an inspiration to so many people. I've been in touch with several other local business owners, and we're planning a community event to address what happened. It would be great if you could attend and speak to what you're doing to make the neighborhood table a place of inclusion and respect. Let me know if you're interested. We're all behind you." Best, Melissa. Calvin read the message twice, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. Melissa was right. He wasn't alone in this. There were people who understood, who wanted to stand with him and make things better. Maybe he couldn't fix everything on his own, but he didn't have to. There were others who were just as committed to fighting for justice, and together they could make a difference. Calvin quickly typed out a reply. "Melissa, thank you so much for reaching out. I'd love to be a part of the event. Let's work together to make sure this never happens again, not just at the neighborhood table, but in any space where people deserve to feel safe and respected. Best, Calvin." He hit send and set his phone down again, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. There was still work to be done, both at the restaurant and beyond, but at least now he had a path forward. He wasn't just reacting to what had happened. He was taking control of the narrative and pushing for real change. While Calvin worked on handling the public fallout, Rosa retreated to the quiet of her home, seeking refuge from the storm of attention swirling around her. The past 24 hours had been overwhelming, to say the least. She had never asked to be in the spotlight, never wanted to be a symbol for anything other than her own life's work. But now it seemed like the world had placed her on a pedestal, and she wasn't sure how she felt about that. Rosa sat at her kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. She had always found comfort in the simple things, a warm cup of tea, a quiet moment of reflection. But today her mind wouldn't settle. Her phone buzzed on the table, another message lighting up the screen. She hadn't checked her phone much today, overwhelmed by the flood of calls and texts from friends, family, and even strangers who had seen the video. They were all saying the same thing, how proud they were of her, how courageous she had been to stand up for herself. But Rosa didn't feel courageous. She felt tired. She had spent her whole life fighting in one way or another, fighting for respect, fighting for her family, fighting to carve out a place in a world that had never fully accepted her. She had thought that maybe by now, those battles would be behind her, that maybe at this stage in her life, she could finally rest. But the world had a way of reminding her that the fight was never truly over. Rosa's thoughts drifted back to that moment in the restaurant, the cold, dismissive look in Evan's eyes as he had told her she didn't belong. It wasn't the first time she had seen that look, and she doubted it would be the last, but it had hurt more this time, because it had happened in a place she had thought was safe, a place her son had built with love and care, with the intention of creating a welcoming space for everyone. But maybe that was the lesson. Maybe safety, true safety, wasn't something that could ever be guaranteed. Not fully. The world was unpredictable, and the fight for justice, for equality, for respect was ongoing. It didn't end with one victory or one act of courage. It was a lifetime commitment. Rosa sighed, setting her tea down on the table. She wasn't sure if she had the energy for it anymore. The constant vigilance, the constant fight. She had done her part, hadn't she? She had raised Calvin to be a good man, to be someone who stood up for what was right. Wasn't that enough? Her phone buzzed again, and this time she picked it up, her eyes scanning the latest message. It was from her sister, Carol, who lived in another state, but had always kept in touch. Rosa, I saw the video. I just want you to know how proud I am of you. You've always been the strongest person I know, and this just proves it. You did what so many people were afraid to do. You stood up for yourself. You're an inspiration, sis. Love you. Carol Rosa smiled softly, her heart warming at her sister's words. Carol had always been her biggest supporter, always the one to remind her of her strength when she doubted it. Maybe that was the point, Rosa thought as she set her phone down. Maybe it wasn't about fighting every battle or winning every fight. Maybe it was about showing up, doing what needed to be done, and then trusting that the people you had raised, the people you had inspired, would carry the torch forward. Rosa leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. She wasn't done fighting, not completely. But maybe it was time to let others take the lead. Maybe it was time to rest, just a little. The day of the community event arrived, and the neighborhood table buzzed with activity. The restaurant had been transformed for the occasion, with tables moved to the side to make room for rows of chairs, and a small stage set up at the front where Calvin and other local leaders would speak. Rosa sat quietly in one of the chairs near the back, watching as people filled the room. It was a diverse crowd, young and old, black and white, families with children, groups of friends. They had all come together to be part of something bigger than themselves, to stand in solidarity and support for a common cause. Melissa Perez, the activist who had organized the event, stood at the front, greeting guests as they arrived. She had been instrumental in helping Calvin navigate the aftermath of the incident, and Rosa was grateful for her guidance. Without people like Melissa, it would have been easy for Calvin to feel lost in the whirlwind of attention and backlash. But Melissa had given him direction, helped him turn the situation into something constructive. Calvin stood beside Melissa, his posture relaxed but his face focused. He was nervous, Rosa could tell, but he was ready. This was his moment to show the community and the world that the neighborhood table was more than just a restaurant. It was a place for change, a place where people could come together and fight for what was right. As the room filled, Calvin stepped up to the microphone, and the crowd fell silent. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Calvin began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. This has been a difficult time for me, for my family, and for this restaurant, but it's also been a time of reflection and growth. What happened here a few days ago was a reminder that we still have a long way to go in creating a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect. But it was also a wake-up call for me, a reminder that I can't take that responsibility for granted. Calvin paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. This restaurant was built on the idea that everyone deserves a seat at the table, that everyone should feel welcome, regardless of who they are or where they come from. And I want to make sure that the neighborhood table lives up to that promise. The crowd murmured in agreement, and Calvin continued. We're going to be making some changes here. We're going to be implementing diversity and inclusion training for all of our staff, and we're going to be partnering with local organizations to create a safe, welcoming space for everyone. But more than that, we're going to be part of the larger conversation. We're going to use this moment as a catalyst for change, not just here, but in our community and beyond. Rosa watched as the crowd erupted into applause, their support palpable. She felt a surge of pride for her son, for the man he had become, for the leader he was becoming. He was taking the lessons she had taught him and turning them into something powerful, something that would have a lasting impact. As the applause died down, Calvin glanced toward the back of the room, his eyes finding Rosa's. He smiled a small, grateful smile, and she smiled back, her heart full. The fight wasn't over. Rosa knew that. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she could step back, even just a little, and let others carry it forward. She had done her part. And now it was time to watch her son and the community around him take the lead. After the community event, the neighborhood table entered a new phase. The restaurant had always been about more than just food, but now it had become a symbol, both for the progress that had been made and the work that still needed to be done. Calvin knew that while the public rally had helped shift the conversation in the right direction, real work was just beginning. He had promised change, and now he had to deliver. In the days that followed, Calvin and his team worked tirelessly to implement the new policies he had announced. Diversity and inclusion training became a top priority. Calvin reached out to local civil rights organizations, bringing in specialists to help educate his staff on issues like unconscious bias, microaggressions, and systemic racism. The sessions were intense and emotional, but necessary. For the first session, the staff gathered in the dining area, the same place where customers would normally sit. The tables had been pushed to the side, and a projector was set up at the front, casting slides onto a makeshift screen. Dr. Linda Franklin, a professor of sociology and a longtime advocate for racial justice, stood at the front of the room, her eyes scanning the faces of the restaurant's employees. This isn't just about learning how to treat customers better, Dr. Franklin began, her voice calm but authoritative. This is about unlearning behaviors and attitudes that many of us have carried with us for years, without even realizing it. Biases don't always come in the form of overt racism. They show up in subtle ways that can make someone feel invisible, unwelcome, or less than. The room was silent, the staff listening intently. Calvin stood near the back, his arms crossed over his chest, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this training was long overdue. He had always prided himself on creating an inclusive space, but the incident with Evan had shown him that good intentions weren't enough. True inclusivity requires constant work, vigilance, and openness to learning. Let's start with a simple exercise, Dr. Franklin said, clicking through to the next slide. I want everyone to think about a time when they felt excluded. It could be, for any reason, your race, your gender, your age, your background. Think about how that moment made you feel. As the staff reflected, Calvin noticed the way their expressions shifted, their brows furrowing in thought. It was clear that some of them were uncomfortable, but that was the point. Growth didn't happen in comfort. After a few minutes, Dr. Franklin continued. Now imagine that feeling every day. Imagine walking into a room and knowing that, without saying a word, someone has already decided who you are, what you're worth, based on nothing more than the color of your skin, or the clothes you're wearing, or the way you speak. The silence in the room deepened, the weight of her words sinking in. Calvin glanced at Maya, who sat near the front, her eyes cast down, her fingers fidgeting in her lap. Maya had been with the neighborhood table since the beginning, and she was one of the most dedicated employees Calvin had ever had. But even she wasn't immune to bias. He remembered a conversation they had had years ago after a particularly difficult day when a customer had made an insensitive comment about her accent. Maya had shrugged it off at the time, saying it didn't bother her, but Calvin now realized that she had likely been carrying the weight of those small slights for years. "I want all of you to understand that this is a process," Dr. Franklin said. "We're not going to change the world in one session, but the important thing is that we start. We open our eyes to ways we can do better, and we commit to that change every single day." When the session ended, the room was quiet, the staff deep in thought. Some lingered, chatting quietly among themselves, while others left quickly, eager to process what they had learned in their own time. Calvin stayed behind talking with Dr. Franklin and thanking her for her work. "It's a good start," she said, smiling at Calvin. "But like I said, this is just the beginning. You're on the right path, but there's still a long way to go." Calvin nodded. "I know. I just hope we can rebuild the trust that was broken." Dr. Franklin placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile warm but firm. "You will. It's going to take time, but you will. The fact that you're willing to do the work means more than you know." While Calvin worked to make changes within the restaurant, the broader community continued to rally around the neighborhood table. Word spread about diversity training and the new policies Calvin had implemented, and soon other businesses began to take notice. Local shop owners, cafe managers, and even nearby restaurants reached out to Calvin, asking for advice on how to implement similar practices in their own establishments. The ripple effect was exactly what Calvin had hoped for. He wanted the neighborhood table to be a model for inclusivity, but more than that, he wanted to help foster a community where everyone felt welcome no matter where they went. One afternoon, as Calvin sat in his office, sifting through emails, he received a message from Gail Thompson, the owner of a popular bookstore down the street. "Hey Calvin, I just wanted to say that what you're doing at the neighborhood table is incredible. I've been following the news and hearing from customers about the changes you're making, and it's inspiring. I'd love to sit down with you sometime to talk about how we can implement similar changes at my bookstore. I've been thinking about it for a while, and after what happened with your mom, I realize it's something I need to take action on. Let me know if you're free for coffee sometime soon." Best, Gail. Calvin smiled as he read the message. He had known Gail for years. Her bookstore had been a staple in the neighborhood long before he had opened the restaurant. They had always gotten along well, but it was clear that this new connection, this shared commitment to creating more inclusive spaces, was bringing them even closer. He quickly typed out a response, agreeing to meet with her the following week. As Calvin hit send, his office door creaked open, and Maya stepped inside, a tentative smile on her face. "Hey, Calvin," she said softly. "Do you have a minute?" "Of course," Calvin replied, motioning for her to sit down. "What's on your mind?" Maya hesitated for a moment, then spoke, her voice low but steady. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you're doing. The training session yesterday, it really opened my eyes to some things, not just about how we treat customers, but about how we treat each other. I realize that there are things I've experienced that I've just accepted as normal, but they're not." Calvin nodded, his heart heavy with understanding. "I get it, Maya, and I'm sorry that I didn't address this sooner. I should have. But I'm committed to making sure that this place is different, that it's better." Maya smiled a bit more brightly now. "I know you are, and I believe you. I just wanted to let you know that I'm with you. Whatever changes need to happen, I'm ready to be part of that." Calvin felt a surge of gratitude. Maya had always been loyal, but hearing her express her commitment to the restaurant's new mission made him feel like they were truly on the right path. "Thanks, Maya," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "It means a lot to hear that." As Maya left the office, Calvin felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had always known that this wasn't a battle he could fight alone, and now he knew that he didn't have to. His staff, his community were with him. As the neighborhood table continued to grow and evolve, Rosa watched from the sidelines, proud of her son, but also feeling the weight of years spent fighting for the same causes. She had always known that Calvin was special, that he had the strength and determination to make a difference in the world. But seeing him take such an active role in creating real change filled her with a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Rosa had become a bit of a local celebrity in the months since the incident. People stopped her on the street, at the grocery store, and even at church, thanking her for standing up for herself and for being a role model for others. It was a strange feeling, being so visible after a lifetime of being overlooked. But Rosa didn't let it go to her head. She knew that she hadn't done anything special. She had simply spoken the truth. And sometimes that was enough. One afternoon, Rosa sat on the porch of her small house, sipping sweet tea and watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes down the street. It was a warm, breezy day, the kind of day that made her think of summers spent with her sister Carol, playing on the dirt roads of their old hometown. As Rosa relaxed into her chair, a familiar car pulled up to the curb, and Calvin stepped out, his face lit with a smile. He had been busy lately, busier than ever, it seemed, but he always made time to visit her at least once a week. "Hey, Mama," Calvin said as he walked up the porch steps, leaning down to kiss her cheek. "How are you?" "I'm good, baby," Rosa replied, her smile soft. "Just enjoying this beautiful day." Calvin sat down beside her, letting out a deep breath as he settled into the chair. "I needed this," he said, glancing over at his mother. "Things at the restaurant have been intense." Rosa chuckled softly, knowing exactly what he meant. "You've got a lot on your plate, but you're handling it just fine." Calvin ran a hand over his face, his expression thoughtful. "I hope so. It's just, there's so much pressure, you know? I want to get it right. Not just for me, but for the community, and for you." Rosa reached over and took his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Calvin, you've already made me proud. You've made this whole community proud. What you're doing, it matters. And I know it feels like a lot right now, but you're not alone in this." Calvin smiled, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thanks, Mama. That means more than you know." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the kids play in the street, the breeze rustling the leaves in the trees overhead. Rosa could feel the weight of the years lifting, just a little, knowing that the fight for justice was being carried forward by her son and by so many others like him. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Calvin turned to her again, his expression serious. "Mama, I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" Rosa asked, curious. "I want to start a foundation," Calvin said slowly, as if he had been mulling over the idea for some time. "Something that focuses on creating inclusive spaces in businesses and communities. I want to help other places do what we've been doing at the restaurant, implementing diversity training, fostering dialogue, creating a culture of respect. I want to call it Rosa's Table, in your honor." Rosa's heart swelled, her chest tight with emotion. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected to become a symbol of anything, let alone a foundation that would help create the kind of world she had always dreamed of. "Calvin," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes, "you don't have to do that." "I want to," Calvin said firmly, his voice filled with conviction. "You've always been the one who taught me to stand up for what's right. You showed me that we all deserve a seat at the table. I want your legacy to live on, not just in this community, but everywhere." Rosa wiped her eyes, her heart full. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Calvin replied, smiling. "Just know that everything I do, it's because of you." Rosa nodded, unable to find the words to express how much his gesture meant to her. She had spent her life fighting for a place at the table, for herself and for her family. And now, thanks to her son, her legacy would continue, helping others find their place too. Months later, the neighborhood table held a grand reopening event, celebrating the changes that had been made and the impact the restaurant had had on the community. The diversity training programs had become a cornerstone of the restaurant's mission, and the Rosa's Table Foundation was already making waves, partnering with local businesses and national organizations to promote inclusivity and respect. The event was packed, with people from all over the city coming to celebrate the new era of the neighborhood table. The walls of the restaurant had been decorated with photos of the community, and in the center of the room, A new mural had been unveiled, a vibrant, colorful painting of a long table, surrounded by people of all backgrounds, sharing a meal together. Rosa stood near the back of the room watching as Calvin took the stage to address the crowd. His voice was strong and confident, and as he spoke, Rosa felt a sense of pride that she couldn't put into words. "This restaurant was built on the idea that everyone deserves a place at the table," Calvin said, his voice carrying across the room. "And thanks to all of you, our staff, our customers, our community, that idea has grown into something bigger than I ever imagined. We've faced challenges, but we've come out stronger. And now with the Rosa's Table Foundation, we're going to take that mission even further. Together, we can create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and respected." The crowd erupted into applause, their support palpable. Rosa smiled, her heart full as she looked around the room. This was more than just a restaurant. It was a movement that had started with a single act of courage and had grown into something that would touch countless lives. As the event continued, people came up to Rosa, thanking her for being an inspiration, for standing up when it mattered most. Rosa accepted their gratitude with grace, though she still felt a bit uncomfortable with all the attention. She had never seen herself as a hero. She had just done what needed to be done. But if her actions had helped others find their voice, then she was grateful. As the night wound down, Calvin came to stand beside her, his eyes filled with pride and love. "We did it, Mama," he said quietly. "We really did it." Rosa smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "Yes, we did." Together they stood in the center of the bustling restaurant, watching as people from all walks of life shared food, laughter, and stories. It was exactly what Rosa had always dreamed of, a world where everyone had a place at the table. And as the evening faded into night, Rosa felt a deep sense of peace. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, she knew that it was in good hands. Her son and her community would carry it forward. Her legacy would live on. The months following the grand reopening of the neighborhood table flew by in a whirlwind of progress and reflection. Calvin had thrown himself into his work at the restaurant and with the Rosa's Table Foundation, which had quickly gained momentum across the city and beyond. What had started as a response to an act of discrimination had blossomed into something much larger, a movement dedicated to making sure that every person in every community had a place where they were treated with dignity and respect. The foundation had expanded its reach, hosting workshops for business owners, sponsoring community events, and providing resources for organizations looking to foster inclusivity. Calvin had found himself traveling more often than he expected, speaking at conferences, meeting with leaders from different cities, and helping other communities create their own versions of Rosa's Table. Each time he spoke about the mission, his mother's name and strength were at the forefront of his words. Rosa, for her part, had embraced her new role as both the namesake and inspiration for the foundation. Though she had initially been hesitant about all the attention, she had come to see it as an opportunity to make sure that the struggles she had faced throughout her life were not in vain. People looked to her for guidance, for wisdom, and she gave it humbly, knowing that her experiences were part of a much larger story, the story of countless others who had been overlooked, disrespected, or silenced. On a warm, sunny afternoon, a year after the incident that had sparked the creation of the foundation, the neighborhood table was buzzing with activity. It was a special day, a celebration of the foundation's one-year anniversary, and a day to reflect on all that had been accomplished. The restaurant was hosting an event that brought together members of the community, local business owners, and leaders from across the country who had joined the cause. Inside the restaurant, the tables were packed with people, some laughing, some deep in conversation, but all united by a shared commitment to making their communities better. The room was filled with the scent of fresh bread, roasted vegetables, and Calvin's famous fried chicken, a dish that had become a staple of the neighborhood table's menu, much to the delight of regular customers. Rosa sat at a table near the window, looking out at the crowd. Her heart swelled with pride as she watched Calvin move through the room, shaking hands and stopping to chat with guests. He had grown into a leader in ways she hadn't imagined, and the foundation was a testament to his vision, his resilience, and his dedication to creating a world where no one had to fight for their place at the table. As she sat there sipping her tea, a young woman approached her, holding a notebook in her hands. She was nervous, but her eyes were bright with admiration. "Mrs. Matthews?" the young woman asked tentatively. "I hope I'm not bothering you, but I just wanted to say how much you inspire me. I've been following the work of Rosa's Table, and it's changed the way I think about community and my role in it. I'm actually writing a paper for my sociology class about the foundation and how it's made such an impact in such a short time." Rosa smiled warmly, gesturing for the young woman to sit beside her. "Thank you, sweetheart. I'm glad the foundation's work is reaching people like you." The young woman sat down, her excitement evident. "It's incredible what you and your son have done. I wanted to ask, what advice would you give to someone like me who wants to make a difference but doesn't know where to start?" Rosa leaned back in her chair, her eyes thoughtful as she considered the question. She had been asked this many times in the past year, but she always approached it with care, knowing how important it was to guide the next generation in the right direction. "Start with what you know," Rosa said softly. "Look around you. There's always something that can be made better, something that's not quite right. You don't have to fix the whole world at once. Just focus on one thing and do it with all your heart." That's what we did with the neighborhood table. We didn't set out to change the world, but when you create a space where people feel safe and respected, it has a way of spreading. The young woman nodded, scribbling notes in her notebook, her eyes wide with understanding. Rosa continued, her voice gentle but firm. "And don't be afraid to speak up when you see something wrong. Sometimes the hardest part is finding the courage to say, 'This isn't right.' But once you do, you'll find that there are others who will stand with you. You don't have to do it alone." The young woman smiled, closing her notebook. "Thank you, Mrs. Matthews. That's exactly what I needed to hear." As the young woman stood and walked back into the crowd, Rosa watched her go, her heart light. The foundation's work was making a difference. But more importantly, it was inspiring others to carry the torch forward. That, Rosa knew, was the true measure of success. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, Calvin joined his mother at the table by the window. He looked out over the restaurant, watching the last few guests linger as the staff began to clean up. "We've come a long way, haven't we, Mama?" Calvin said softly, his voice filled with pride. Rosa smiled, resting her hand on his. "We have, baby, and we're just getting started." Calvin chuckled, shaking his head in disbelief. "I still can't believe how far this has spread. I thought we were just building a restaurant, but now it's a movement." Rosa's smile deepened, her eyes warm with love. "That's because you've always had a vision, Calvin. You've always wanted more for this world, for this community, and now you're helping make it happen." Calvin nodded, his gaze steady. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Mama." Rosa squeezed his hand, her heart full. "I just gave you a place to start, baby. The rest, you did that on your own." Together they sat in the quiet of the restaurant, the hum of the city outside, the weight of their shared journey resting comfortably between them. The neighborhood table had become more than a restaurant. It had become a symbol, a place where everyone was welcome, where everyone had a seat at the table. And as the night drew to a close, Rosa knew deep in her heart that her legacy, one of love, resilience, and unwavering belief in justice, would live on for generations to come. As Rosa and Calvin sat together, the soft glow of the restaurant's lights reflecting their shared journey, it was clear that the neighborhood table had become more than just a place to eat. It was a symbol of hope, inclusion, and the power of community. Their work wasn't finished, and the movement they had started was only growing stronger. If you've been moved by this story, don't forget to hit subscribe and like to stay updated on more stories about resilience, justice, and the strength of the human spirit. Together, we can make sure everyone has a place at the table, because change starts with all of us.